Welcome back. Now in the last lesson we learned that no matter what your goals for change are, inevitably you're going to have to learn how to face vulnerable feelings by learning how to shrink down the overwhelm that would have ordinarily kept us stuck. Now overwhelm is not always obvious. Sometimes it kind of sneaks up on us. Classic examples with things like procrastination. With procrastination, the overwhelm kind of stays hidden underneath and distracts us away with thoughts to justify putting it off until we kind of realise that we're going around in circles and not going anywhere. So look, when you've set goals for change and the challenges ahead seem so big it feels like your mind's going to kind of choke on it, remember the trick is in learning how to break them down into bite-sized chunks so that your mind can much more easily digest them. The first time I really started learning how to communicate with myself differently was that experience on the bridge. However, I didn't just begin by walking back and forth straight away. In fact, the very first time that I went down to that bridge for this purpose, what happened was I got to the top of the bridge and that's when those feelings of overwhelm really started to kick in. So this is the moment where I started learning how to communicate with myself. And what I did differently this time, I realized that it's not just what you say to yourself. You've also got to listen. And so what I did differently this time, I started to listen. I started to imagine what would that inner child part of me, if I could have a conversation with that part of me, what would they be trying to tell me right now? Now this is a really interesting and powerful thing to do. I don't think a lot of people spend a lot of energy really just listening to that inner voice. Because once I started doing that, what I realized was that inner part of me was essentially trying to say, look, I'm scared. Don't make me do this. And what I realized then is that that part of me had been essentially saying that or trying to be heard for a long, long time. But I had just been blocking it out or reacting by trying to force myself to do things, which explains why I was having so much difficulty trying to motivate myself to do things and was met with that internal resistance. So I did think about this for a moment and I thought, how do I respond back to my inner child's concerns without giving up and walking away, but without dismissing them and trying to force myself to get the job done? And so I imagine having a conversation back and forth, kind of like a negotiation process. And so this is what I said. I said, okay, what we're going to do, we're just going to take a few steps, okay? It doesn't matter if we get to the end of the bridge or not. We're just going to take a few steps. And if that's all you can do and that's too overwhelming, that's fine. That's okay. We'll turn around and go back home. And now I'm a little bit more fine-tuned to listen to the response. And what the response was essentially, look, if we take a few steps and you don't get to the end of the bridge, you're going to be angry with me because you're going to treat that as a failure. So I want to stay right here. At least that way, I'm not going to get blamed for failure. And again, what I realized was that that's kind of true. That's how I had been treating myself the whole time without conscious awareness. So the way I responded this time was, okay, this is what we're going to do. No matter how many steps you take, we're going to count every step as progress. Because even a few steps is better than no steps. So we'll create an environment or a condition that will count whatever steps as unconditional progress. And then if that's all we can do, that's fine. We'll go home. We'll still count that as a step forward, which is better than nothing. And this time, the response was a bit less resistant. So that's what I did. I just took a few steps and then it started to get a little bit wobbly. I thought, okay, that's it. That's as far as I can do. The overwhelm was pretty strong here. But what I did differently this time was I got to as far as I thought I could go, right to the outside edge of my comfort zone. And then I said, okay, we've got this far. Let's just take one more step. If we've come this far, one extra step isn't going to hurt. And so that's what I did. One extra step, stretched beyond the comfort zone, and then I went back. Grabbed my bag, started walking home, but then started checking in again. And then realised that the feeling underneath was essentially, hang on a second, hang on. That was okay. Like, it was scary, but we could handle it. How about we go back and do at least that again? And if we can get a couple extra steps, great. If not, that's okay. Every bit of progress counts. And so I went back, did the same again, got a few extra steps, got as far as I thought it could go and said, okay, one more step. Went back and again, just repeated the process. And each time, going back to the bridge seemed a little bit easier because I was doing something I was already familiar with. It was that stretch of taking one extra step. That was the only bit that was really quite intense. But after about 5 or 6 goes, eventually I got to the end of the bridge. Then eventually I was able to go back and forth a couple of times. And by the end of the day, I could go back and forth with no problems at all. That was the first time I really started to change the way I communicated with myself, not just what I'd tell myself, but how I'd listen and respond. Then a few years later, when it came time for me to build my coaching business, that's when I found myself really out of my depths again. I had no good business experience or understanding, couldn't afford coaching or getting someone to teach me. So I'd frequently find myself not knowing what the hell I was doing, way out of my depth. And again, I get caught in that cycle where one or two things would go wrong, and then it'd blow it up in my mind. I'd see one or two things go wrong and then think to myself, that's it, everything's going to go wrong, nothing's going to work, I'm a failure, the business is a failure, everything's totally blowing it out of proportion. And so what I started doing differently here was I started to set a rule for myself where every little bit of progress, no matter what I did a little bit different or did something that I wasn't used to, I'd make a rule so that I would count every bit of progress as a step forward, no matter how small. And so what would happen was then when I'd sort of zoom out and see the bigger picture, it became a lot easier to shrink down the problem moments when I had a whole lot of other little bits of progress to compare them to. Before I was doing that, it just seemed like the big problem moments stood out and there was nothing that I could use to really shrink it down. So fine-tuning my awareness and attention to notice and pick up on all the little steps forward, no matter how small, that made it a lot easier to shrink down the problems when I'd zoom out and try and tell myself it was okay. But then I'd zoom back in and I found that the most helpful thing to tell myself at this point was to actually ask a question. Now, at first I had to do this with conscious intention. It wasn't easy at first, but with enough repetition, eventually it got to the point where I just started thinking this way without even having to try. And so that thing when I zoom back in was basically, okay, what's the next step? And by the way, the trick here is to break it down so small that next step is so small and so easy to step out and stretch and reach, it's almost impossible to resist. It won't create that inner resistance on the inside. Let me run you through another classic example of how you can utilize this back and forth self-negotiation practice when it comes to clearing hurdles and getting started on a task that you would ordinarily procrastinate about. So let's use the example of getting up super early in the morning to go to the gym. Now, by the way, if going to the gym or starting a business or conquering a fear, if none of these things are personally relevant to you, that's fine. Just apply the same technique, the same formula when it comes to whatever goals for change that you have that are going to be personally relevant for you. So you set your alarm the night before, 5 a.m. the alarm's going off, you're waking up, what's the first thing you're thinking? First thing is overwhelm. You're playing a picture in your mind of being at the gym and squeezing out the last rep on an intense set of squats. And of course your mind is going to show you a picture like that because that scene requires the most amount of energy furthest away from the amount of energy you have right now sitting in bed. So your mind's going, hang on a second, this is how much energy I have here. This is how much energy that's going to take. I don't have the energy. You know what? It's okay. I'll wake up later or I'll go to the gym tonight or I'll do it tomorrow. And that's how the procrastination starts. See, to a child, that's like getting them to stand on the edge of a riverbank and telling them to swim across this big, wide river with a strong flowing current that's full of bull sharks. Of course, that's going to be overwhelming. So the trick is to start creating some stepping stones so that they don't have to stretch out as far, and it makes it a lot easier and they'll become a lot less resistant. So how do you do that? So you interrupt your own thoughts. The alarm goes off, you see that intense set of squats in your mind and you interrupt, you interject, you say, hang on a second, hang on. That's too far. Don't worry about going to the gym. Don't worry about thinking that far ahead. That's okay. Let's just break it down. Zoom right in. What's the next step? The next step is we just get up and have a shower. How about we just get up and have a shower and that's it, okay? If after that you want to go back to bed, that's fine. Now, of course, logically, you know that once you actually get in the shower, you're not going to feel like going back to bed after that. But your unconscious mind doesn't know that. And so let's say that doesn't work though. Let's say that's still too much of a stretch. Let's say the resistance on the inside is, no, because it's cold and I'm going to have to stand in the shower waiting for the warm water to come on. That's still too far. Don't make me do this. So, okay, how do we break it down even further? Well, how about we just sit up? How about we just sit up in bed and that's it? That's almost impossible to resist. So, okay, you sit up in bed. That's it, right? So what happens now? Do you say, all right, now let's go to the gym? No, again, that's still too far. For starters, praise the effort. Always praise the effort. You sat up in bed. That was a stretch. That was one extra step from lying down. So, what's the next step? Well, how about the next step is we just peel back the blankets and stand up. That's it. After you do that, if you want to come back to bed, that's fine. We'll still count that as a step of progress. So that's a little bit further this time, but you've already sat up, so it's not so much of a stretch. So you peel back the blankets, you stand up, and straight away you feel that resistance saying, I just want to go back to bed. So you go, okay, stop. Let's just take it one more step. We're already standing up, so how about we just stay standing for an extra 10 seconds, and that's it, and then we'll go back to bed. So you count 10, 9, 8, etc., etc. You get down to 0, and you go, okay, and you get back into bed, but now it feels a bit different because you stretch past that comfort zone that little bit extra. So now it kind of feels like a bit of a waste going back to bed. And you can't really get back to sleep so easily anyway. So you go, all right, what's the next step? How about we peel back the blankets again, we get up, we stand up, and this time we just go to the shower and turn it on. And so then you turn on the shower, you have the shower, you pack your gym bag, you get in the car, you drive to the gym, you go upstairs, you start a warm up, you start the first set, etc., etc. By this stage, you've got momentum. And probably after you get in the shower, you're going to be fine anyway. The lesson here is it's all about making a start. By breaking down the steps so small that it's almost impossible not to reach out to the next stepping stone, you create the momentum and pretty soon the rest is easy. Artists and writers and other creative people will often describe what they call writer's block or moments where they're essentially getting overwhelmed and they procrastinate and they can't seem to get started. And if they're a particularly good writer, they'll tell you that the strategy to get over that is to just start writing anything, create a very permissive headspace, put unconditionally accepting rules on it, and eventually you start to do something and then you kind of loosen your mind up a bit and pretty soon you've made a start, you've got the momentum, and the rest starts to flow from there. So it's all about, it's like getting a rocket off the ground. Most of the fuel and energy is spent getting up off the ground, but once it's out past the Earth's atmosphere, it just goes through space with very little resistance at all. So what are we really doing here? Essentially what we're doing is we're creating a bond, a rapport, a sense of trust with our inner child. You can try and force children to do things according to your rules as much as you want, but it's like having a really strict teacher in the classroom. They might follow the rules while the teacher's there, but inevitably the time's going to come when the teacher has to leave the room. And then those kids are just going to want to muck up and play because they're sick of having to try to comply with these strict rules from someone that they don't feel is really on their side. So making that self-communication process a two-way street, not just telling yourself what to do, but stopping and listening with an attitude of unconditional acceptance. What that does, it may be a little bit painful at first. When you imagine a 7-year-old version of yourself, you're going to hear that 7-year-old saying things like, don't make me do this, I'm scared, why aren't you on my side? That's perfectly common. If that's the response that you pick up on at first when you start really listening to that inner voice, that's just because you spent so long numbing and ignoring that voice. But by using that negotiation strategy to say, look, it's okay, we're just going to take a few extra steps And that counts as progress. There's no rules about you must reach this point, otherwise it's failure. That's going to scare a child when they're not already feeling confident. So by taking the rules off and saying that any few steps of progress still counts and creating that unconditionally accepting and permissive environment, what you're doing is you're decreasing the parental voice of must, and essentially you're taking the pressure off yourself. Once you take the pressure off, then you just start moving those few steps ahead, and as long as you praise the effort, that's going to get you moving along that scale of confidence. By the way, let's say in that example, you get to the gym, you have a workout, but it's not the super great 100% motivated, energetic workout you were hoping to have. So what do you communicate to yourself about that then? Do you say, oh, that was a waste of effort, I didn't burn as many calories as I thought, I didn't lift as much weight, I didn't work out for as long as I thought? No, because that tells you that was failure. Instead, you zoom out, okay? Zoom out, see the bigger picture. If you keep zooming out and you keep seeing the bigger picture, one of the things that you start to become aware of is that the conditioning effect, the relationship that you develop with that thing on those occasions, the relationship that you develop with yourself on those occasions is much more important in the long run than the outcome. So maybe you didn't clean the whole house that day. What did you tell yourself about the experience? Maybe you didn't burn as many calories or get down to your ideal weight that you'd planned for that week. So what? 10 years from now, that's not going to mean anything. You can lose all the weight and put it back on. But what did you tell yourself about that experience? That's going to have a lot more impact in 10 years than how many calories you burnt, what weight you got down to, how much you lifted, how much you cleaned, whatever the outcome is that you were distracted by. That stuff's not going to matter in the long run. So using the analogy of the parent-child relationship, basically what you're doing here is by showing that you're listening and breaking it down and creating unconditional acceptance and praise, you're essentially creating a bond of trust between yourself, your adult self, and the child self. So eventually when the child learns to trust you, they start to let their guard down, become less resistant, and start to essentially accept your lead, so then you can start to lead them in the direction that you want to go. So step 3 in the self-communication process is to stop, interrupt your pattern of thoughts, and to pay attention to that inner child voice. Show that you are listening. And respond back by zooming in and asking yourself, what's the next step? Break it down so small, it's like creating stepping stones to help a scared child cross a river. Count every bit of step of progress unconditionally and praise the efforts over the outcomes. And that's going to make it a hell of a lot easier to dissolve the overwhelm next time you zoom out and tell yourself that it's okay. Now, so far, the first 3 steps of this communication formula have all been about using that personal boundary to kind of shut out the critical, black and white, sort of fixed mindset of the outside world to create a permissive headspace on the inside so that we can change the internal dynamic between our inner parent and inner child. But the reality is, there's only so much we can block out the voice of the outside world. The reality is that the world around us still is always going to have an impact on the inside. The people that we surround ourselves with especially have the most powerful impact on what happens on the inside. But there's one simple change that we can make to the world around us that will have the most powerful impact to the world on the inside. And in the next lesson, I'm going to share with you exactly what that thing is. I'll talk to you soon.
When we set a goal for change that we don't already feel confident with, it's inevitable that our mind will view it as too far to stretch, especially when we're low on energy and motivation. This overwhelms the inner child, which becomes resistant, often manifesting as avoidance and procrastination. The key here is to form a bond of trust with your inner child so that he or she begins to accept your lead, making it easier to keep moving forward. The child will only accept your lead when it feels heard. To do this, imagine having a conversation with a 7-year-old version of yourself. It may be a bit painful at first, but it's important to listen to what your inner child wants you to know about how he or she has been feeling towards that stretch. Once you've unconditionally acknowledged those feelings, respond by asking yourself, what's the next step? What you want to do here is to open a negotiation process by breaking down the process into bite-sized pieces to create stepping stones that make the stretch much smaller. This will help you make a start which will soon develop momentum and then become easier. To condition the task to start sliding across the confidence scale, remember to recognize and praise every bit of effort unconditionally, irrespective of the outcome. When you pay attention to all the little steps of progress, it becomes a lot easier to shrink down the overwhelm when you zoom out and see the bigger picture. Remember also that when you zoom out, you'll realize that the unconscious conditioning that your self-communication has in each moment will end up being far more important in the long run anyway. So far, the process has been on our internal dynamics, but in the next lesson, Stuart will show you one simple step you can take to change the environment on the outside, which will make the most powerful change on the inside.